Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Steering Committee number 4. We're starting a few minutes late. We'd like to get going. Just note for everyone again that snacks and water and copies of today's slide deck are out on the table. Bathrooms are down the hall to the, I guess that's that direction. These proceedings today are being video recorded. We're not live broadcasting, but video recorded and will be posted on the ADWR and CAWCD websites after the meeting. Thanks everyone for coming today, and welcome again to CAP. I'd like to note for those of you that have your devices programmed to auto-connect to the Wi-Fi here, the password has been changed from probably the one that we forgot was in our phone. It is all one word, your water, your future. There's a few little pieces of paper out at the tables. So if you're unable to connect, that's why the password is changed. Tom.
Yeah. So we'll start, as usual, going through a brief review of the agenda. We'll do welcome introductions and recap of meeting 3. Ted already finished the welcoming, but I welcome everyone as well. Thank you all for coming. A little bit of status. We're about at the halfway mark. A report out about the Ag Mitigation Workgroup. Then report out on the Tribal ICS Workgroup. Your comments, questions that haven't been addressed as we go through the presentations. And then some discussion about preparation for the steering committee meeting number 5 on September 27th. And finally, a call to the public. So as we go around for the introductions, we'll ask the delegates to introduce themselves, their alternates, and who they represent. So we'll start today to my left with Stephanie.
Stephanie Smallhouse, President, Arizona Farm Bureau. My alternate is Philip Bashaw.
Doug Dunham, alternate for Joe Geisel, AppCore Water Company.
Hunter Moore, Governor's Office.
Karen Caesar, CAP board member, and also just like to let you know that Lisa Atkins experienced some car trouble on the way here, and she's stuck on the side of a road waiting for a tow truck and sends her regrets.
Joe Olson, Metro Water District. My alternate is Wally Wilson.
Tim Tomier, Director of Tucson Water. My alternate is Andrew Greenhill.
Paul Orm, Pinell County Irrigation Districts, and my alternate is Dan Jones.
Spencer Keams, Home Builders Association of Central Arizona, and my alternate is Rob Anderson.
Rusty Bowers, LD 25, and my alternate is Mr. David Cook.
Senator Gail Griffin, LD 14, my alternate is Jeff Cross.
Senator Lisa Otondo, Legislative District 4, and my alternate is Senator Andrea D'Alessandro from District, I don't have her district here, 2. Thank you.
Lois Wakimoto, Mojave County, and my alternate is Jamie Kelly.
Thank you. Lisa Lance with the Department of Interior, Office of the Solicitor. I'm the alternate for Leslie Myers, the Reclamation Phoenix Area Office Manager.
Kevin Moran, EDF, alternate for Ted Kowalski of Walton Family Foundation.
Good afternoon, David Godleski, Southern Arizona Home Builders Association. My alternate is Dennis Rule.
Wade Noble, Yuma.
Virginia O'Connell, Arizona Water Banking Authority, and my alternate is Terry Surasi.
Brian Biesmeyer, Scottsdale Water, and my alternate is Kathy Rawl.
Javier Sudovich, City of Goodyear. My alternate is Dan Cotterman.
Brian Wong, representing Pima County Agriculture, and my alternate is John Kamink.
Laura Grignano, Central Arizona Groundwater Replenishment District, and my alternate is Perry Benamelis.
Shane Leonard, Maricopa County Ag, Roosevelt Water Conservation District, and my alternate is Brad Strader.
Cheryl Lombard, Valley Partnership. My alternate is John Graham of Sunbelt Holdings.
David Brown, Cattle Growers.
Fred Schneider with Arizona Water Company. I'm the alternate for Bill Garfield.
Cynthia Campbell from the City of Phoenix. I'm the alternate for Catherine Sorensen.
Marlon Dixon, alternate for Stephen Lewis, Gila River.
Ted Maxwell for the Southern Arizona Leadership Council. My alternate is Kip Volpe.
Sandy Favorites for Freeport.
Dave Roberts for Salt River Project, and my alternate is Chuck Podolak.
Ted Cook, Central Arizona Project. My alternate is Suzanne Tickner.
Thanks, everyone. We'll move on to the next slide, a recap from meeting number 3 of the steering committee. Again, very quickly, the delegates received the presentations on Reclamation's 24-month study and the near-term risks in the Colorado River system. We had updates from both the Ag Mitigation and Tribal ICS work groups. And you can see here, we are kind of morphing the name from the Tribal ICS work group to the Arizona ICS Framework because of the interaction of the tribal and non-tribal ICS programs. We had strong support from the delegates about creating the Ag Mitigation Work Group and continuing its work. And then the support from the delegates as well to have the Tribal ICS Work Group stood up. And we had lots of volunteers for that work group as well. So a review of the schedule for the steering committee. Next meeting, September 27th from 1 to 4. October 10th, October 25th, November 8th, November 29th. All those meetings will be here. That will just, I think, make it easier, and it will make it cheaper for me. So I do want to say one thing, though. We laid out this schedule, and it was a very aggressive schedule, but I would like to challenge folks a little bit. I would like to be able to finish on November 8th, not November 29th. I would like to sit around the Thanksgiving table and be able to say, when it comes to me, what I am thankful for. And we got DCP done. So help me out there. We have a little bit of an update at the halfway mark. And really, this is a pat on the back for everybody involved, both sitting around this table, in the audience, folks who come to the work groups. And we're really thankful that the steering committee has remained focused on its mission and objectives and is adhering to the sideboards. We haven't seen a lot of superfluous issues being thrown out on the table. We have enough to do, as we talked about before, in the short time we have to do that. So we really want to thank everybody for that. And again, we repeated the mission statement here, discuss and recommend how to adopt and implement the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan in a way that is acceptable to Arizona water users. And our objectives are to seek broad commitment and support for the implementation of the DCP in Arizona and recommend the appropriate and sustainable processes and tools for that implementation. And again, in bold, obtain approval by the legislature of a joint resolution authorizing the DWR director to agree to the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. And again, sideboards, including respecting the process, respecting and operating within existing legal, contract, and policy frameworks, and having open discussion, I think have been followed very well to date. And again, I thank everybody for that. Again, we have established 2 work groups to address 2 of the 4 essential elements, Ag Mitigation and Tribal ICS, now Arizona ICS Framework. So in future presentations, you're not going to see Tribal ICS anymore. You're going to see Arizona ICS Framework. And again, work groups are targeting providing recommendations to the steering committee at the next 2 steering committee meetings, the mitigation plan and package by September 27th, in the Arizona ICS Framework by October 10th. And I think we're making great progress, as you will hear, as we go through this presentation. And we're going to start this next discussion with Ted leading the way.
So I would like to add my my gratitude to the delegates and to all the folks that are participating in the work group for the progress that we've made so far. We are only, about halfway through, really 5 of the 9 meetings, but if we do end up one early, this is halfway. And as Tom said, I place much of the reason for these positive results as what Tom said, is that we've been very focused on doing what we set out to do at the beginning of focusing on DCP, trying to stay away from other things that aren't necessarily part of DCP, regardless of how important those might be, and respecting working within the structure that we have is all very, very important. And the cordiality and collegiality of doing the work in these rooms and in the work groups is working for us, and keeping everything pointed in the same direction. So thank you very much. So Tom went through a moment ago the progress briefly on 2 of the essential elements, ag mitigation and tribal ICS. As Tom alluded to, the ag mitigation is expanding into maybe a broader discussion about mitigation in general. And the tribal ICS is broadening into more of a discussion about ICS and a program in Arizona in general, with those 2 pieces as core elements within the elements. So what about the other 2 elements? And those were CAP excess water and the Arizona Compensated System Conservation Plan, or just Arizona Conservation Plan. Some of the issues related to CAP excess water are being discussed because everything's connected to everything else within the ag mitigation group primarily, and that includes the water that's in Lake Pleasant, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, and also water that's in Lake Mead. Annual coordination of ICS release and delivery is part of the discussion in that work group, and there may be some further refinement in those settings. In other words, ag mitigation and the tribal ICS discussions. They're such as what's listed there: the approach to CAP turnback water that is not predictable either in timing or quantity, but we need to come to some kind of agreement as to how that's going to work. Likewise, the Arizona Conservation Plan, lots of discussions about conservation, how it might be generated, from where it might be used, particularly in the context of mitigation or ICS, and many of those issues are already being discussed in the work group. So the point we're trying to make here is that, well, I guess not quite yet. The point we're trying to make here is that we may not need to spin off work groups on excess water or on Arizona Conservation Program, because much of the work might be done in those other work groups, and what's left over can be dealt with by the steering committee itself and help us to actually get to this mid-November endpoint, if possible, without having to set up extra rounds of meetings outside of here. That's our hope. If we are successful in getting to our internal deadlines on ag mitigation and tribal ICS, I think we can do that. We'll be able to do that. So let's move to the report out from ag mitigation work group meeting number 3. That was on September 5th. The work group had previously identified a number of mitigation tools. Many of you saw that in steering committee meeting number 2 down at the library. Those tools were classified into 2 categories that we just gave labels to, of firm and potential. I'll explain that a little bit more on a subsequent slide. The work group reviewed approaches to preparing a mitigation package based on existing supply and demand assumptions. And what those 2 approaches were, you also heard about at a previous steering committee meeting. It was the basic approaches were determine what mitigation would be needed on a year-by-year basis as determined by the shortage conditions in the following year from the August 24-month study, kind of a year at a time. The other way was make some assumptions up front and determine a fixed package that we would determine now that would last throughout the interim period through 2026. Those are the two basic approaches. The work group examined the mitigation volumes at full mitigation, and there are two cases of full mitigation. One would be for all three ag AMAs, and the second was for Pinal by itself. The work group outlined remaining decisions for an ag mitigation framework, and we're going to go through all this in another couple of slides. And the work group expressed support to explore broader mitigation for impacts to NIA and CAGRD developers. That's what I was getting to a moment ago when I said that the ag mitigation has kind of expanded a little bit to have a discussion about mitigation to the other pools that will be shorted under DCP. The work group set a goal to bring its findings and recommendation to the steering committee at the September 27th work group meeting, 2 weeks from now. There is another ag mitigation work group meeting scheduled for next week, Wednesday. It's at ADWR in room 3125 at 1 o'clock. So we'll continue that discussion then with the hope of doing whatever work else that we need to do prior to the next steering committee meeting on September 27th. So we'll dig a little bit into the details here. I mentioned a moment ago that the two approaches to putting together an ag mitigation package would be making some assumptions and establishing a fixed mitigation program, basically determined in advance, or to do it a year at a time based on specific shortage conditions as they become known every year. So what we've shown here are an example at the top box there. We call it fixed mitigation. This is only one way to do fixed mitigation. There would be a lot of ways. We could say pick a number, 150,000 acre feet or some other number all the way across. That's what it's going to be, and we agree to it, and that's a fixed plan. It has no basis necessarily, but you could do it that way. We could move down to the next one. We could say that we assume that we'll have a tier 1 through 2022 and then a tier 3 starting in 2023, and assume that those are the numbers that would be required for mitigation and just set those as firm in advance. What the first box there under fixed mitigation represents is a weighted average from the Bureau of Reclamation 5-year probability table between the percent of time that there's a tier 1 to be projected and the percent of time there's a tier 2 to be projected, taking the weighted average of those times the tier 1 shortage mitigation quantity requested by the ag districts of either for all three AMAs or for just the Pinal AMA, and taking the weighted average of those two. So the result of doing that arithmetic is in the top box. This would be an example of a fixed mitigation schedule for all three AMAs, starting at 150 in 2020, and then it's got some bumps in it because probabilities aren't always smooth, and then declining to around 100,000 acre feet toward the end of the period. For just Pinal, it follows the same shape, but it's a little lower. It starts at 106 and settles out at between 70 and 75,000 acre feet. The two boxes there for annual, one is for the three AMAs, all three AMAs. The other lower box is for just Pinal, and it shows what the tier 1 shortage mitigation request was and the tier 2 shortage mitigation request here. And if on a year-by-year program, basically step 1 would be in after the August 24-month study, determine what tier of shortage, if any, Lake Mead would be in the following year, and provide that the identified mitigation quantity for that tier, either for all three AMAs or just a Pinal AMA, whichever path we end up going down as a steering committee. So those numbers are shown there. One thing in either the fixed case or the annual case, 1 year at a time, There would be no mitigation in a Tier 0 above 1075 because a full supply would be available by definition. Nor would there be any mitigation in a Tier 3 because in Tier 3 there's no supply for the ag pool in either DCP or the 2007 guidelines. So no mitigation for different reasons, either in a Tier 0 or a Tier 3, either under the fixed or the annual approach. Now, only about half of the delegates were at these meetings, so this is pretty complicated stuff, and we've got it all shoved into one slide. So we'll pause for questions here for a moment. Okay, we'll keep going. If some questions come up later, we can try and answer them. So these are, at least for the conversations that have happened so far in the ag mitigation work group meetings, the quantities and kind of shape of mitigation amounts that have been requested. The other side of the coin is what resources exist to provide that mitigation. And the list that we've seen before, and we've added a little bit more information here that we discussed at the last work group meeting, are shown here. Lake Pleasant water, there's a little water in Lake Pleasant that is there, that is in excess of operational needs, 50,000 acre feet or so. And over the 7-year period, 2020 to 2026, if that was annualized, it would be about 7.14 thousand acre feet per year. There is no creation cost because this water has already been delivered basically into Arizona, and it's available for use for mitigation or some other purpose. CAP ICS, there are currently, and we've got another slide in here later on that actually Tom is going to cover. CAP has at present about 300,000 acre feet of ICS in Lake Mead right now. Not all of it has been completely validated through the Bureau of Reclamation accounting process yet, but there is about 300,000 acre feet there. There are programs in place right now during 2018 and 19 when we will still be out of shortage both of those years to create another 120,000 acre feet of ICS and put that in Lake Mead as well. That water, there is no additional cost to create it. We don't need to deliver it. It's in the lake. So let's move on to the next one. System conservation, typically compensated system conservation, and we've split this into on other slides into two types of system conservation. One type of system conservation that could be made available for mitigation. That's why it's on an ag mitigation slide. And then there could also be potentially system conservation for leaving water in Lake Mead in excess of the DCP reduction that would be required for Arizona. But what we're focusing on here is what we think would be the quantity of system conservation that would be available for mitigation purposes. It's about 50,000 acre feet per year. That is about the average of this type of mitigation that has been done for the last 5 years. So over the 7-year period, about 350,000 acre feet. The creation cost range there, both in dollars per year and total dollars, is based on the lower range there of $8.25 million per year for 50,000 acre feet is based on the average cost of the mitigation that's been, the conservation that's been done over the last several years, $165 per acre foot average. So we've considered that going forward from 2020 to 2026, that might be a little bit more expensive, and the number that we've used here is $200 an acre foot, and that's just to kind of bound the range of what we think is a reasonable cost for that quantity of water. In total, somewhere between $58 and $70 million to do that level of conservation. Those three categories of water we're referring to as firm. Please don't attribute any particular properties to that use of that term, other than we're able to identify the quantities, we know where it is, we know where we can get it, and it's basically is available right away. Other supply, and those add up to 820,000 acre feet. Other supplies that have been identified during the discussions have TBDs under both quantity and cost, and more work needs to be done on those. There is a possibility of new ICS coming forth. That would be both tribal and non-tribal ICS that has not been created yet, and Tom will cover more on that during the tribal ICS update, program update. USF to GSF conversion, we've talked about that before. And then at the end of the list is groundwater development, including infrastructure funding, and potential and one thing that I guess everything is on there. Never mind. So we don't know what those quantities are. We've scoped them internally at the staff level, but for now they're just being shown as to be determined. So if we take the mitigation requirements that were shown on the last slide and these sources of supply and combine them, we can have something like this. And this is a graph that was shown at the last Ag Mitigation meeting. And for those folks that were there at the Ag Mitigation meeting, you know that we cleared up one question that had been raised earlier about would there be a step down in the mitigation request when the ag pool shrinks? And the answer to that is no, that the differential impact on the ag pool remains the same even after the step down. So those tables showed on the last couple of slides and this graph here reflects the revised data that we handed out at the end of the meeting. Those of you who weren't there to see the earlier stuff, then you're getting the right numbers now. What's graphed on this graph is the vertical bars include the potential supplies that were listed on the previous page. What's in the light blue solid color at the bottom are those three first items, the so-called firm supplies of water in Lake Pleasant, water in Lake Mead, existing ICS, and projected ICS that will be created in the next 2 years, and ongoing system conservation at the same level that has been done in previous years. What's in the white dotted line bar at the top is just an estimate, a scoping of what might be available from those other tools that were listed at the bottom of the previous slide. Superimposed upon that are the dark blue line is that statistical fixed calculation weighted average for the full mitigation for all three AMAs for ag, and the green line is Pinal only. It starts at 150 for the dark blue line and 106 for the green line, which are the numbers that were provided from the ag community, and then it moves downward from there. I might add, we had another question that came up at the last meeting, which was, is Harquahela Valley Irrigation District numbers included? Where is that included? Well, it clearly is included in the all three, in all, well, maybe not clearly. It is included in the 150 number for all three AMAs. It is not included in the Pinal only. And the assumption between the difference between those two is that, and these are two other action items that will be followed up on, we think, before the next meeting, is will Maricopa, Phoenix AMA Ag require mitigation, and will Pima Ag require mitigation? And if not, we can move from the top line to the bottom line. So the question is, where is HVID? It's 14,000 acre feet. It's in the 150, but it's not in the 106. So even if the answers come back from Maricopa and Pima, no mitigation is required, we still have to include HVID, so that green line would have to move up by 14,000 acre feet. And we didn't want to change the numbers a second time that nobody had seen, so we'll wait till the next meeting to make that update. But that green line will just move up a little bit. Off to the right of the graph there is a dotted arrow going up, and what we're intending to convey with that is that one of the discussions that came up at the last Ag Mitigation Workgroup meeting was we need to have a broader conversation about mitigation for the NIA pool and what we're calling the developer pool or the CAGRD pool. So that we will bring some information in for the next meeting next Wednesday that will reflect that. But if the overall plan is there's some firm supplies, there's some supplies that we can develop, that we don't have to use all the firm supplies to do this, and we can, as the other supplies are developed, can use some of everything rather than all of one thing. There is lots of potential here for doing other kinds of mitigation than just ag mitigation. And that's that little arrow there is a reminder for that. The next slide is similar to this one. The bars and the lines mean the same thing, but what we're illustrating here is what an annual mitigation plan might look like under a scenario where, on 1 year at a time, we experience a Tier 1 shortage in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 23, and then a Tier 2 shortage in 24, 25, and 26. Then based on those other tables, at full mitigation, this is what the quantities that would be provided under that type of scenario. But again, you wouldn't know until August of the year before what was going to be done in the following year. Blue line, all 3 AMAs. Green line, just Pinal. That would also have to move up based on the inclusion of HVID. And once again, there's room to do other types of mitigation if that makes sense. So I think if you look at this graph, and there's lots of examples of how this could, depending on what assumptions you would make. If you look between this graph and the earlier one on fixed, it shows you kind of the advantages and disadvantages of those two approaches. Flipping back to the previous graph, this is flatter and lower in the early years and higher in the later years, but you know in advance what's going to happen. And there's some upside that's being given up and some downside that's being avoided. Here, on this type of thing, you don't know what it is until a few months in advance. And this was discussed at the work group meeting. But basically, the advantage of this is that you only need to deploy the resources that you're sure you need to deploy. This is a trade-off, and actually listed on the next page is a decision tree that shows some of the remaining decisions that need to be made in the ag mitigation work group. The first tier there is do we agree that we should approach a annual type of process or a fixed schedule that we agree to in advance? These are the two basic choices, and I suppose there could be some hybrid of that. By hybrid, we don't mean do this year and then change our mind to do something else and then change it back and do something else, or hybrid mean do this for those folks and this for those folks necessarily. But there could be some hybridization of the fixed and the annual approach. The second tier of decisions there is, do we need mitigation for all 3 AMAs or just the Pinal AMA plus HVID? I'm going to add that in every time now. And I think if we have the feedback that folks are running down, Shane on behalf of Maricopa Ag and Brian on behalf of Pima Ag, we'll know one way or the other what do we need to do. And I suppose there's an outcome that it might be yes for one and no for the other, and we'll have to come up with something else. And then last but not least, and this is the most difficult one, is full mitigation for ag, whether it's 3 AMAs or just Pinal, or partial mitigation for ag, and based on what rationale. This is something that we have to do and most likely be the last decision that we'll make once we know some of these other things. So that's the decision tree diagram for people whose brain works that way. For everybody else, here's a list of the questions that still need to be addressed. Annual versus fixed approach, and nail that down. 3 AMAs or just Pinal and HVID, full mitigation or partial mitigation, and if it's not going to be full, what are the alternatives to that? Explore potential for broader mitigation to NIA and CAGRD developer impacts. I mentioned that. That's not really on the decision tree, but it's something that we'll bring some info at the next meeting to discuss. And then once we work our way through those items, then we get down really to the final and most difficult work is developing a sufficient level of commitment on water quantities and funding quantities to make this happen, at least at a sufficient level of certainty and enforceability for the folks on the steering committee to be, well, first the work group and then the steering committee to be comfortable that we have a thing here, a program that we can depend on to go forward as part of the bigger puzzle of the DCP implementation plan. The work group will provide a recommendation to the steering committee by September 27th. That is our goal. So this will allow an ag mitigation meeting next week on Wednesday that's already scheduled, and if necessary, we'll have a fifth one prior to the 27th to get this done by that date. Joe has a question.
Just a clarification. Thanks for the rundown, Ted. But on the total firm supplies, you have the 60,000 acre-feet a year drawdown from CAP ICS. Did I hear you correctly that there would be the opportunity to replenish that ICS drawdown to ensure we then had that fallback resource?
Why don't we defer that question, if you don't mind, until we get into the tribal ICS discussion? As I think that will answer some of that question. I don't want to get ahead of Tom's explanation, all of that, but we intend to keep the Arizona allocation of ICS capacity in Lake Mead as full as possible. So it may not be 1-for-1 CAP replaces what it's used, but that's, so we'll get to that. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah. On page 10, which that's the right, no, you're on that slide. And I've raised this issue before about using the term compensated system conservation to talk about ag mitigation. And I think I wasn't fully understood in the sense that it's not just a function of nomenclature. A system conservation program that's operated in the lower basin, and I'm going to explain this because I know, Ted, you understand this and Tom understands this, but I'm not sure that the majority of people in this room do. Those programs are designed for water users to make voluntary contributions to benefit the system. That is the Colorado River system, i.e. Lake Mead. The concept of trying to put together a program, regardless of the name, to do the same type of thing where you can have people forbear water and it gets pooled and delivered to the agricultural pool is not possible when there is an NIA shortage. And this is not a request for NIA mitigation or a conversation about NIA mitigation, which is a really strange misnomer, because our contracts already provide that if that water is forborne, that water has to be delivered in shortage to the NIA contract holders who are shorted. And so I'm a little disturbed by the idea of calling whatever you want to call this concept compensated system conservation, but it being identified as a, quote, firm supply, because I don't think it can be a firm supply in the event that there is an NIA shortage. It must be delivered to those contract holders unless each and every one of them forbears. And I haven't heard any effort to try to talk about that or ask that or poll that in any way. So I guess I'm raising the question now. If you're talking about two-party agreements where someone wants to direct their water to a specific agricultural user, that might be a different thing. That's a subcontract issue. But if you're talking about CAWCD pooling water that's forborne, that's excess. And that excess has to be delivered first to the NIA contract holders. So that's not a request for mitigation. That's just a statement of fact. So I have to express again my concerns that we're putting this down as somehow it's a fixed volume when in fact it is not. And more importantly, there are some other alternatives on there, USF to GSF, and especially groundwater development and infrastructure that really have been inadequately looked at by the working group. There are specific proposals and people who are standing ready, willing, and able to have that discussion, but those discussions have not happened. And I'm not sure if they haven't happened because we failed to talk about the financial impacts of those or don't want to talk about the financial impacts of those. But I guess I would encourage the working group, of which I'm a member, to turn to those issues now because I don't think this idea of total firm supplies in that volume is really a realistic statement of fact.
So I'll address several of those points. While maybe we haven't used the term forbear for that excess water to get back to the ag community in a situation where those NII contracts are not being filled, I think we have talked about in the diagrams where we show the water moving up in priority, that would be a voluntary thing. And if that's a necessary component of it, then that's a necessary component of it that we have to deal with. And I think the reason in my mind that compensated system conservation mitigation, as it's described now, is in the firm category is because once we have this deal put together, it will be firm. People will make those commitments up front. It's not going to be something that we're going to be asking for, you know, every year, and maybe it'll work that way, but we're expecting commitments up front that this whole package, including that element, is going to be agreed to so that there is certainty and it becomes firm at that point in time, and that's why we're describing it that way. So, I don't know, Ted, if you want to add anything.
Just a couple of things. Yes, Cynthia, you're correct on a lot of that. Yes, Tom and I do understand how the contracts work, and that in a situation where there was a shortage and both the ag pool and the NIA pool would be reduced, that any water that would flow to the ag pool for mitigation would need to have the consent of the forbearance by, if you want to use that term, the intervening NIA pool if it was being shorted to. That has to happen. But as Tom said, if that's part of the equation to make this program work and those consents have to be obtained, then that's going to have to be part of the equation to get that done. To the point, though, of including this quantity on this slide, if it's a reasonable assumption that conservation by higher priority water users of about 50,000 acre-feet per year, as has happened in the previous 4 years, happens, then there's a quantity of water that would be available to use for mitigation, subject to all of these other agreements, and not including not just ag mitigation, but potentially NIA mitigation. That's why it's on the list. That's why it's shown on this slide, and the description that I had earlier of as we deploy some, and I think Tom and I both agree that we need to have more conversation about the other things that are on that list, if not right away, sometime before we begin implementing this, to develop these and interleave the use of those supplies with these supplies so that we have a diversified portfolio, not just in what we're using, but what we have available for use as we go forward. There is room for potentially room for other types of mitigation, including NIA mitigation, if that's what those parties need to have to agree to the overall structure. So that is why these quantities are on that list. Other versions of this list, we do have separate lines for system conservation that's created for mitigation purposes and system conservation that's created for additional contributions to Lake Mead to acknowledge that there are differences there in it, and the point we've made on those slides, which I think Tom is going to show that one, is it's up to the people who do the conservation what they want to happen to their water. In some regard, but it has to have the agreement of these other parties that have some rights with respect to that water as well. But like Tom said, all of those things need to be elements of the grand agreement that we come to make all of this work. No one wants to get to a point where we've come up with a structure, put it in place, and then have a party or two parties say, wait, you forgot about me and my rights here. We want to avoid those kind of situations.
And I'll just end by saying, Cynthia, I heard you talk about proposals that are out there, and I would encourage you to bring them forth in the work group meeting as soon as you can.
We have brought them forth. They're on your screen as TBD, but they haven't been discussed. They just haven't been discussed at all. There hasn't been a serious discussion of USF to GSF or groundwater development of infrastructure other than USDA funds. And I guess my last question, I do have a question though, and I want to make sure I understand what you're asking NIA contract holders to do. Is it my understanding that prior to the end of this year, you are going to ask NIA contract holders to sign a blanket forbearance for these volumes of water for 6 years, regardless of shortage conditions? I'm not sure that's a reasonable request, and I apologize for putting anybody on the spot, but let's get down to what you're asking.
That, I think that is in the universe of possibility, yes. And same type of thing is going to be needed, by the way, to make tribal ICS work, because both creation of ICS, bypassing shorted pools, and recovery of ICS, bypassing shorted pools, has the same implications here. So in order to make mitigation work, whether it's ag, whether it's NIA, whether it's developers / CHRD, and to make tribal ICS work, we're going to have an understanding and agreement. And if it takes a written agreement with people's signatures on it to do it, whether it's for 1 year or 7 years, then that's what we're going to have to do. We can't leave those questions unanswered until we get into the program and then figure it out.
And I'll just add this, that as we look at this issue of how that will all play out, I'm not sure the word blanket forbearance is the right way to describe where we might end up, but from my perspective, the folks in the NIA pool are being benefited by the DCP because it protects the higher priority water that they have. That has to be part of the consideration in this whole package about who might do what and who might sign forbearance in certain situations. And we haven't talked about that yet either, but there's a lot of moving parts, as you said, Cynthia, to be discussed as you move forward to put this framework for this agreement together.
I just want to mildly correct Cynthia. At, I think it was the second ag mitigation meeting, Dan Jones, my alternate, made a presentation on the USF to GSF option, something we've had out in discussions with other groups for quite some time, and something we're still stand by, ready to discuss and include in any final program, but we're just not going to let sit and wait for USF folks indefinitely on a plan along those lines. We need a firm. If this thing's going to fly at the end of September or whatever, we need the firmest supplies we can line up. And so far, that particular concept hasn't matured enough to the point to really produce any firm numbers on that chart.
And I think at that meeting, Dan mentioned that he was going to be having side group meetings, which is why I approached him after that meeting and said, I'd like to be part of that small group to talk about that option. We haven't had a meeting. I'd love to have the conversation about that a little more. So.
I guess take another step backwards is the annual planning versus the 6-year window. Is any of the supplies that may be pledged to that, is that what we're looking for? Is a 6-year commitment? Because I may be able to move some of my M&I water around, but I don't want to give it up for 6 years if there's really not a shortage.
It's part of what has to be worked through, and if somehow this group determines that that we are going to embark on an annual type of process where we determine every year what what the mitigation quantity is going to be, I think we're going to have some idea about, well, what range of possibilities could happen and what supplies are going to be available to do that. Otherwise, it's an empty program.
So, sorry, I just wanted I actually made a statement at the working group, and I'll maybe follow up from that as well. You know, I share that any solution, and obviously the numbers show that there's a possibility of water existing in the system to help us mitigate those that need it, but any solution that looks at a bucket of water as the source of that water where it needs to be saved, I think should be looked at carefully. I noticed that there's kind of a little bit of a range in the definition of the word firm water, firm sources. I think ultimately firm means it physically exists. And with that, I kind of go back to what I said in the working group, that we shouldn't underestimate the value of the groundwater development solution. That in that case, that water is there, and it should be an essential part of the equation. And I think, at least from my perspective, that it adds certainty to that water being there, and perhaps it's a tool that would be under the control of those that need it. So we should be looking at it a little bit more seriously, would be my take on this. And we would love to have in the next working group meeting some conceptual look at what that plan would look like.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, Brian.
Thank you. Just a thought on, and I guess just a thought of I think some of why these comments are coming, because I see some different looks on faces on why they would come now. But from my own standpoint, you know, things are going fast and a lot of information is put out, and sometimes it takes a little while to process that information. So I did attend the ag mitigation, and one of the thoughts, if you could go back to the slide that had the firm and the, I guess the other options on it. Those talk about, you know, and we just had a discussion on firm and such, and I want to go on that. But I would say when we ultimately get there, some thought ought to be given to priority of how that water is done, because if you can develop that USF to GSF program, wouldn't that be better than taking water out of the lake to save the lake? I mean, I still have an issue with the ICS use, but to me, if we're going to look at mitigation, something like the USF to GSF should be, you know, if you can get that water and get somebody to place that water, that ought to come first. I mean, we ought to do that first before we start taking water out of lakes. So, just for my 2 cents on finally grappling with that issue.
So along that lines, then, I would ask those who have USF water to let us know if you're willing to have that USF water go to GSFs in Pinal as soon as you can. Put together a list, who they are, how much water.
Or not.
Or not. Yeah. And I agree that if you can keep the water in the lake, which is the whole purpose of the DCP, that's great, but we know that USF water going from Phoenix AMA to GSF in Pinal is going to result in a long-term storage credit in Pinal, not in the Phoenix AMA.
Well, if I may, I think that's one of the issues to try to work through. I thought that was part of that entire issue, was to try to work through that. And if you can get that worked through, then I think then there are some pledges. If it can't be worked through, then that may change the dynamics.
So I'd certainly be interested in hearing a viewpoint of the water providers in the Phoenix AMA about increasing the groundwater mining that would result if you put the water in Pinal and recover the long-term storage credit in the Phoenix AMA, because you could make that happen, I suppose, if there's agreement that that's a valuable use of groundwater and that you're that the increase in the mining of groundwater that would result is worth it to make the DCP work. That's essentially the issue, right? So maybe that is time to say maybe that's what we use our groundwater for this time period to make that happen.
I would add to, referring to this chart that's on the screen right now, that the white portion of the bars with the dotted line outline do have heights, and there you see that they're different. So there are some assumptions behind that, but we have refrained from sharing what our assumptions were on those things to let these conversations develop. Maybe in hindsight being overly cautious because there's very few people that are in some of these categories on this particular slide here, and to be in a position of saying, well, Tom and I are deciding that you should give up your water to do this thing. So I for one will say we will consider what we can do at next week's steering committee meeting to share some of those assumptions about where those quantities might emerge to get things going. And people might not like that, but and some people might like that. I think some people will like that because right now it seems that we've just got a TBD and we're a couple of weeks away from wanting to be done. So we might need to give that a little nudge. Paul has a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, Brian, go ahead and finish.
One more, just to Tom's comment. I want to make the argument in that maybe it's not mining, it's the recharging of the water. So true, I mean, that's what it's about. But I would say if there's more excess putting water into the ground in Maricopa versus making up for some of these issues, I would make that argument as well.
Well, Brian, there's a legitimate discussion to be had about the net outcome of all of this, because if we're protecting the lake from going down to elevations where huge shortages might occur, and then the groundwater pumping is going to be maybe way bigger than the groundwater pumping we would do to make the USF to GSF transfer. But those are all things that need to be considered in how all of this plays out and what the net benefit is and how you deploy the resources you have in a balanced way as much as you can balance things.
I think Paul was first and then Kevin.
Just a couple of things. We are generally supportive of this concept, and I don't want my remarks to make it appear we don't support the USF to GSF concept in general. In fact, I think we raised it initially. But we're concerned about any program that to an extensive amount replaces ag pool water, which carries no recovery credits with it, with GSF water that does carry recovery credits with it. It puts another demand on our groundwater supply in the Pinell AMA, and that concerns us. Now, it doesn't mean we don't think it can be part of this program, and if it ripens, that it could actually displace something like, some of the ICS or something like that. So we're open to that certainly that discussion, but to displace it entirely, replacing ag pool water, which carries no recovery obligation, with only GSF water, is a problem for us. But it can be a piece of the puzzle, and I want to make that clear. And it can be it can serve as a reduction in what's been designated for ICS if it really ripens.
I just wanted to offer a comment or feedback that I think it's in our interest and the state's interest to continue the distinction in nomenclature between system conservation as it's been developed, distinguishing that voluntary compensated conservation that benefits the river system stays in Lake Mead, and it has implications in the upper basin as well. I think maintaining the distinction between that and how we talk about it, from voluntary compensated conservation that's part of a mitigation plan. I think there's benefit in that distinction in language, frankly, because of external audiences who impact Arizona water and who impact some of the challenges we face as a state. Just to name two, the philanthropic community, which in 2018 has contributed $1 million to system conservation in the lower basin. And the second audience, frankly, is members of Congress and federal agencies who've come to know what system conservation is, the pilot program that was created, and the other parallel compensated conservation programs that have left water in the river system. So I think that distinction is important. So that's a little bit of a feedback on slide 7.
Thanks for reminding us about that. And as I said a moment ago, we do have in other slides those distinctions being made. But I might add one important point here too, while I'm thinking about it, is that all of the system conservation that has been done to date in Arizona and probably elsewhere, but let's just focus on Arizona, has been done when we are not in shortage. And so under that situation, the only forbearance that is required is by CWCD under its contract. As Cynthia was pointing out, once we're in shortage, that gets a lot more complicated, and either compensated conservation for mitigation or compensated conservation for leaving in Lake Mead will require the consent of the folks who have a contract right to take that water.
I feel like I'm at my first junior high dance. Everybody wants to dance, nobody wants to ask each other. I didn't ask. So it strikes me as a way forward. Let's do this. As a member of the steering committee, Maricopa Ag Committee, whatever you want to call me, the guy that tries to break up the monotony sometimes. If you're a USF, if you have the capability of storing in a USF, you have just as much an obligation to get a hold of us as we do you. And so if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to do what EPCOR did, which is to reach out and say, hey, under times of shortage, we might be interested in storing some of our water in Pinal County, and then we can work with the folks involved on recovery. That's what we're talking about. That's the second side of the coin, which is recovery. We are happy to have that. If that's not been something that has been inured to folks' satisfaction about how we have or haven't approached, then you have my apologies. I just was under the assumption, which we know how that goes, that if you were interested in potentially moving some of that water through, you would reach out. Between now and next Thursday, we're hoping to solidify some things. So for example, and I'm not promising not to break Doug's other foot if he backtracks on this, but you know, Doug was very specific, EPCOR was very specific when they said under times of shortage. RWCD can assist in that endeavor because of the location of our facilities. Maybe SRP can as well under certain circumstances. Maybe Arizona Water Company can. But if we're going to make this work, then we need to make sure we understand we need you to participate. So if you're interested in that, then help us out. Give us an opportunity to bring that as something that can move forward. If your considerations are we need to work on how to recover it, then we know we've got to make that step. We can do it, but let's get beyond the everybody's sensitive about stepping on somebody else's toes. I certainly understand it from the standpoint of the director and CAP. We don't want to put something in the ether that looks like, because of the concerns that have been expressed, that we're just mandating, but we also just can't stand on the sidelines waiting for somebody to approach us. So please, as a member of the Ag Steering Committee and those around, if you've got an idea that you want to move some water here, or you got an idea about how some other water might come up, let us know so that we can be effective in how we're communicating that. Because if not, we're just going to end up right back here in 2 weeks looking at each other going, hey, what about system conservation? What is, what isn't it? As again, by example, the next ag mitigation meeting, director and Mr. Cook will get a letter from RWCD that says under the forbearance 3, we'd like to continue out through 2030. Don't have to worry about RWCD's 3750 acre feet being mitigated. We're going to have reached out to the other Phoenix districts so that they can at least give us an idea. So there's going to be some concrete numbers showing up. But to the extent that folks are interested, you got to let us know, and we will be more active in reaching out. I can guarantee you.
Thank you. I just got a statement on your USF, GSF opinion. It was presented in the working group and to Paul Orm directly that it is our USF that is very significant and culture-wise, that we, as council, approved the return of the river. I want the people to be aware that we could not include our USF in any such program. That's my statement. Thank you.
Let's move on. All right, thanks, everyone. I thought actually that was a great discussion. So we will move now into the discussion about the Tribal ICS work group. Quick recap of the first two meetings held on the 31st of August and September 10th. We did review an outline of an Arizona ICS framework. Parties to that would be DWR, BOR, and CAWCD, and we'll get into more details in this presentation today. That would include paths for tribal and non-tribal ICS. We reviewed the basics of the intentionally created surplus program as it exists under the 2007 guidelines and how it would exist with the drought contingency plan. We examined the potential uses and trade-offs for the use of the ICS within the Arizona implementation framework for the DCP. And we did reach consensus. It was pretty unanimous, I thought, on moving forward with the proposal that we put forth and getting to working on the documents that would put more meat on the bones and get into the details. Again, and with the goal of bringing recommendations forward to the steering committee by the October 10th meeting. So to describe a little bit more about this Arizona ICS framework, two agreements are needed. One, a framework agreement for the Arizona program that would include the Secretary of the Interior, DWR, CAWCD. That's necessary for a variety of reasons. We all have different roles and responsibilities that interact with the Arizona ICS framework program. And these are just some examples. I mean, DWR in relation to the allocation of the state's capacities for the intentionally created surplus and ability to facilitate coordination and cooperation among the water users to make all of this work. For reclamation, as trustee for the tribe, as water master in the lower basin, operator of the system, and manager and certifier of the ICS that gets put into the lake. And then CAWCD's contract, unquantified contract to use Colorado River entitlement, and the fact that they also to date have been the major creator, user, and holder of ICS in Arizona. And then second, the ICS delivery agreement between the Secretary of the Interior and each participating tribe. That delivery agreement will spell out the details of delivery to the tribes and harmonize those aspects with other delivery contracts for intentionally created surplus in Arizona. So go ahead, Ted. So we did discuss some guiding principles for the Arizona ICS framework, and the first is that ICS is a meaningful water management tool for Arizona water users. Again, tribes have expressed interest in participating, and the ICS capacity has been utilized to date based on a first-come, first-served approach, and it's pretty much been developed by CAP in past and continuing programs. The ICS capacity, that is the detailed annual creation, annual delivery, and total accumulation, should be shared between tribal and non-tribal, includes on-river water users and CAP. And the available ICS capacity, again, creation, delivery, and total accumulation, should be fully utilized to the extent practicable. Ted touched on this earlier. There was a very strong feeling that ICS is an important tool, and we should try to keep the pool of ICS available to us, our space, full as much as we can. There was actually discussion at the work group about can't we increase Arizona's accumulation volume beyond even the 500,000 acre feet that would result with DCP. I think that was very reflective of the value of this program and the growing understanding of the value of the program and how much flexibility that can create for us. We did talk about that quite a bit. The reason that each state's getting 200,000 acre feet more than what they have now, so 300,000 to 500 for Arizona, is that within the confines of the existing environmental compliance, we believe that we have coverage for those additional volumes. It's Reclamation and Interior that are looking at those issues. They're also looking at Endangered Species Act compliance for those additional amounts, and there may be some need at the upper end of the river, just below Lake Mead, for some additional action there. But we want to be able to implement the DCP in a meaningful time frame, and going through a long environmental compliance process would not really facilitate that end. But we did agree in that meeting that the importance of that tool to the state of Arizona means that when we sit down and renegotiate the 2007 guidelines, that Arizona would advocate for an increase in that volume at that point in time. But we have lots of other things to think about what we would advocate for as the guidelines are renegotiated. So we're going to get into the creation, delivery, and accumulation volumes, put these charts together. So in Arizona, our creation capacity is 100,000 acre feet. That's not changing in DCP. We propose to split that equally between the tribal and non-tribal pieces of the program. But we also have the concept that temporary access can be given between the two pools to encourage that the capacity is fully used. We know that we need to have coordination among the tribal participants, and that's something for Reclamation and the tribes to work on, how the tribes will share that pool and interact with each other in that pool. We also understand that we need annual coordination among the three parties, DWR, Reclamation, and CWCD, to facilitate this program. And we wanted to point out that there are limits on ICS creation below Lake Mead elevation 1025, and that perhaps that needs further discussion, and that's really about the backstop language in the DCP about taking additional actions if the DCP doesn't achieve the goal of slowing the crashing of the lake, and those collective collaborative actions among the three states. We might want to use this tool in that or other ways. I will also point out that in the DCP, there is an opportunity for one state to borrow another state's creation capacity. So if Nevada, for example, is not using all of their capacity and we have capacity in our total accumulation volume, we could ask Nevada for that year to let us use their creation capacity. So that is some flexibility we built in to the DCP, again, recognizing the importance of this tool and of getting water into the lake as much as possible. Moving on to the delivery capacity. Again, for Arizona, it is 300,000 acre feet. Again, no change there in the drought contingency plan. The limitation on the delivery capacity is important in terms of balancing what's going into the lake, what's coming out of the lake, and trying to achieve the net benefit of having more water in the lake at the end of the day than you would otherwise have without the DCP and without the ICS flexibility built into the DCP. So again, you can see we split this 50-50 again, 150 for the tribe, 150 for the non-tribal side. And again, same concept about temporary access between the two pools. We will have to have annual coordination among the Arizona ICS participants DWR, CWC, et cetera, and stakeholders to assess the impacts of delivery on Lake Mead elevations. This is really important. Again, we just don't want to take the water out of the lake to potentially put us into a deeper shortage trigger, and it will be a bit of a balancing act. So there's going to be a lot of need for coordination and outreach to stakeholders as we consider how to do that. And again, the coordination internally for the tribal pool is going to be run through reclamation with the tribes. We needed to remind everybody that conversion of ICS to DCP ICS counts against the delivery capacity if Lake Mead is below elevation 1045, and if there's no delivery below 1025. And DCP ICS capacity, or DCP ICS, as you all might recall, is recoverable when Lake Mead goes back to 1110 elevation under the DCP. And so that's another flexibility tool to avoid stranding water, but getting the benefit of the ICS for a long period of time, propping up the elevations of Lake Mead. Move on. So the more complicated one now is the accumulation capacity, which with the DCP will be 500,000 acre feet. And again, the guiding principle here is to split that evenly between a tribal 250,000 acre foot pool and non-tribal 250,000 acre foot pool. Again, temporary access potentially between the tribal and non-tribal pools. It's not permanent. Again, towards the bigger guiding principle of maximizing the ICS tool in general. Our goal then is to fill up as much of the capacity as possible prior to the first shortage, which right now we think is going to be 2020. So we want to get that water in the lake. And if we don't have shortage in 2020, maybe we'll get more water in the lake in 2020 itself before we hit the shortage in 2021 or whenever that might be. And there's another slide after this one that will help explain how some of this works in terms of a graphic representation of the numbers. But CAP is prepared to reduce its ICS creation volume in 2019 in an amount equal to the volume of ICS created by an Arizona tribe in 2019. So if a tribe comes forward and says, you know, we want to create, so CAWCD, can you potentially reduce your desire to create in 2019? That will be worked out. Again, but if there's nobody out there coming forth to create ICS, CAWCD has their plan already kind of in place in 2018 for the rest of 2018 and in 2019, and can certainly do some valuable creation of ICS. For the total accumulation volume then, CAP is prepared to evacuate capacity to make up to the 250,000 acre feet available in a year when tribal ICS projects are implemented and additional capacity is needed. And the next slide will make this a little bit more clear why that is needed. And again, when CAP does evacuate that capacity, it's going to consider mitigation actions, needs, the balancing of keeping the water in, taking the water out, converting to DCP ICS, lots of balls to juggle there, and how they might evacuate their capacity. So let's go to the next slide.
So using this graphic, we'll take another stab at explaining the couple of bullets on the previous slide. Recalling what now Tom and I both have said a couple of times is that the guiding principle, particularly for the accumulation volume that Arizona has for ICS and Lake Mead, is to fill it up and keep it as full as possible. And number one, that's why there's this temporary access provision even on the accumulation volume that if it's split theoretically 50-50, if one of those halves is not being fully used by the parties to whom it's assigned, then the other party would have the right to temporarily fill that space. So we have an illustration right away about what happens if one party is filling a portion of the other party's space. And there are two examples of that. First, let me explain this graph one more time. Note that 0 is right here, and what is shown on the on the x-axis here is capacity of accumulation capacity in Lake Mead. CWCD has right now 103,000 acre-feet of system efficiency ICS in the lake, validated, does not count against the accumulation capacity in Lake Mead. So that's why it's shown as below the 0 line here. There's 24,000 more of existing, this is binational ICS, that does count toward the volume, accumulation volume. It is in the lake, it's validated. 175,000 acre-feet of extraordinary conservation ICS in the lake, but it's pending the validation process. Probably that will all be wrapped up as part of the DCP approval process. We're anticipating that. And then 120,000 acre-feet of anticipated creation in 2018 and 2019, about 60,000 acre-feet per year. That is composed mostly of something that Mr. Leonard referred to a little bit ago about Ag Forbearance 3, ag districts not using their CAP water, and that water reduction of consumption qualifies as ICS. We'll leave it in the lake, and nobody else is doing it. We've got an ongoing program under this principle to use the capacity. We'll keep doing it unless tribal ICS program is put into place, and we are still in 2019 before ICS is active. We only have 300,000 acre-feet. If a tribe comes forward and says, we've got an approved exhibit, we've got a program in place, we would like to create some ICS in the lake, and if CAP does what it intends to do in 2019, it will encroach into this space between 250 and 300. Then the concept on the earlier slide was then CAP, instead of creating ICS, would allow the tribe to step in and fill that space and probably create system conservation water in Lake Mead instead of ICS. Maybe that's 50,000 acre-feet. After DCP is in place, and let's say now the capacity is expanded to 500,000 acre-feet, and let's say CAP is occupying part of the space that's allocated to tribal ICS. Well, the guiding principle is keep the space as full as possible. So if and when tribal ICS participants come and fill up all the available space and have more ICS that they can create, then CAP will find a way to get out of the way and make that space available to tribal ICS, either through delivery or something like that. It's only 50 to 70,000 acre-feet in the large scheme of things. It's not a large number, but we wanted to use this to illustrate this flexibility and how this temporary access might work. We're already over the 250 line here, so we need to have a tool and a mechanism to make this work, and it may need to happen right away.
Ted, let me jump in. I want to make sure everyone understands that the binational ICS, the light blue, that's not Mexico's water. That's CAP's water. So it was CAP-funded conservation in Mexico under Minute 319, and that water now has been transferred to CAP's account. So that's CAP's water.
So are there any questions on this kind of complex split of the accumulation capacity, trying to balance maximizing its use but still have a mechanism in place so that the folks to whom that capacity is assigned would have access to their own capacity, but somebody else can use it, and if necessary, get out of the way when the other party's allocation is being filled up. All of this would be, all of these terms that we're talking about, this so-and-so agrees to do this and so-and-so agrees to do that, would be part of this agreement that would be executed. The framework agreement would capture all of these terms and be brought to the appropriate bodies for approval, including my board. Ready to move on? Sandy.
Just, so at the end of 19, we're saying, where would we be? We would be at 300,000?
Well, right
It's-
now, under the guidelines, Arizona's limit is 300,000.
Yeah, I understand that.
So
I'm just-
without DCP expanding it to 500,000, if CAP is just bopping along doing its ICS, it would have to stop
Yes.
at 300,000. If this other water was available, we could still leave it in the lake, it would be system conservation. If DCP is in place and there's an expansion to 500,000, even though DCP might be approved in early 2019, it wouldn't become operational until the 2020 water year because it's all dependent upon water ordering process.
So to get, let's see, to get to 500,000, yep, I get that, okay. So I'm just gonna reiterate a comment I made earlier at the work group meeting. And I understand there's some environmental considerations that limit all of this. So the 500,000 is really the maximum that we could get in under the current environmental allowances for that. But if we have water and if the idea is to maximize or to get the lake level up as soon as possible, we can only put in 100,000 each year, assuming we have that water's available.
And that we have the capacity here.
Yeah, and we've got the capacity. I still feel it would be better to try to get as much in if we have to go over the 100,000. I understand that's a limitation under your current, negotiations and that sort of thing, but I'm curious what the other states are thinking on that as well. Or everybody's okay with sticking with their maximum amount?
Well, as Tom explained, the interstate DCP includes a provision for borrowing among the states on the annual creation capacity. So in Tom's example, if Nevada's not using all of theirs and we can do more, we can borrow it. We have to have the space here to put it, though. That borrowing does not include borrowing of someone's accumulation space. Probably everyone would agree that hey, more would be better. There's some considerations about that that we don't necessarily need to get into here. But as Tom pointed out, the difficulty is the amount of time that it would take to do the NEPA clearance to include that. If we design a plan here that depends on a number that's bigger than this, then we have a plan that won't work. So we can have a conversation with the other parties about what do we need to do to expand this capacity. But in the meantime, we need to work a plan that will use what we have.
And I appreciate that. I'm just saying as well, it's the annual limit. So you only have 100,000 you can get in next year.
Right.
If you could get in 181,000.
All at once?
Yeah, all at once. Could that be a consideration?
We might be able to borrow some capacity. We might be able to borrow some creation capacity. Brian has a question.
Does California and Nevada have the same limitations on the amount of creation and withdrawal as Arizona, or do they have different amounts?
No, they have different amounts. We need to get a slide in the library for this because we get asked this at every meeting. California's numbers generally are larger. They have 101.5 million acre-foot accumulation capacity, and it's expanded to 1.7 under the DCP. I can't find the text message that I had with all of this.
Nicole will know
Chuck
these
or Nicole
numbers.
can tell us,
Yeah.
300.
Use the mic. Let her use the mic.
The maximum for Nevada's accumulation is 300,000, just like Arizona. And then under the DCP, they would increase to 500,000.
And creation and delivery for California and Nevada?
Delivery for California is 400,000. For Nevada, it is 300,000, and for Arizona, it's 300.
Got it, Wade? Annual creation for Nevada is the only one we haven't covered, and that's 125,000 acre-feet a year.
Yes, Joe.
So to follow up on the comment I had made about the ag mitigation, 60,000 acre feet, if we were not to borrow any other state's capacity, we're obviously limited to generating 100,000 acre feet a year. If we are then depleting the ICS pool, Arizona's ICS pool at 60,000 acre feet a year, and it's going to take us, without borrowing other capacities, then 5 years to max our total ICS allocation. So the concern would be is if there wasn't any borrowing of other states' capacity, how are we able to then fill up that 500,000 as soon as possible? Because if we are doing the full 60,000 acre feet a year drawdown.
Well, two things, and I appreciate what you're saying, that yes, it would take at 100,000 acre feet per year 5 years to fill up the whole 500,000 if you're at zero. But
no, I'm saying if we have 100,000 capacity to store and we're taking 60,000 of that then out of that pool, right. So that it's 40,000 acre feet a year to be able, and that's 5 years then for the 200,000.
Okay. Yes, but we're expecting the tribal ICS program to bear fruit as well. So there potentially could be simultaneous release or use of ICS for mitigation purposes and creation of ICS by other parties to replace it.
But we're still limited. So what you're saying is if we're taking out 60,000, we're able to generate more than 100,000 in a year?
No, it could only be 100.
That then my
so
initial
the net is
stands.
40 net going
right.
into
Absolutely.
Into
that
yeah.
And that
yeah.
then takes 5 years.
Yeah. Any other questions before we move to the next? Is this mine too? Okay, this is another rendition of the slide that we had shown earlier under the ag mitigation. We're using this as well in the tribal ICS discussion. And even though Tom and I said that we would refer to tribal ICS as Arizona ICS going forward, we're not all the way there on all of our slides and nomenclature. Once again, we see the various tools listed down the side: water in Lake Pleasant, existing CAP ICS, that includes the 120,000 that we would anticipate doing this year and next year. System conservation, compensated system conservation, broken out into two categories, as I discussed before, both done for mitigation or done for additional water in the lake above Arizona's reduction obligation. Tribal ICS broken into three pieces here, and I'll explain that in a second. On river ICS with a notation here with the double asterisk that this is shown on one line, but it really works the same way as tribal ICS does, that I'll explain. USF to GSF, groundwater development and infrastructure. And on this slide, we've shown that there are two basic ways that these tools, this conserved water, whether it's already been conserved or whether it will be conserved in the future, can be used in one of two primary ways. One is to be used for mitigation purposes. So water is conserved, and it basically becomes then a portion of the Arizona reduction quantity. So for example, in a tier 1, that quantity is 512,000 acre feet. So if there is some conserved water that is available for mitigation, then that conserved water becomes part of the reduction that Arizona takes, rather than the lower priority pool that would otherwise give it up, and that mitigation water can be available to that entity, but Arizona still meets its reduction obligation. Again, in tier 1, the example is 512,000 acre feet. The other use would be that conservation is created and it is used to exceed the amount of reduction that Arizona is required to take, and we're calling that additional contributions, where in this case conservation would be generated, it would be left in Lake Mead, it would not be made available for mitigation. Most types of conservation that are shown on this page can be used for one or the other just because of its physical attributes, but not both. There are a few exceptions. So for instance, the water that's in Lake Pleasant, it's already been delivered into Arizona, it's sitting in Lake Pleasant, it can't be put back in Lake Mead. So that water is only available, if it's used at all, for mitigation. It can be delivered to somebody, and that would reduce the amount of diversions that we would have to cut back on the river and still leave 512,000 acre feet in the lake. Likewise, the existing ICS that's been generated or will be by the end of 2019 can be used for mitigation, but it can't create any additional contribution in Lake Mead because it will already be there. Same, and now system conservation, we've split that into two. System conservation that's created for and made available for mitigation, that's what it's for. For system conservation that's created to produce additional water over and above Arizona's reduction, that is available for additional contributions. At one time we had this on one line, compensated system conservation, yes, yes, and that was what prompted the conversations that Cynthia was referring to earlier about the need to distinguish between those two things, and even the name of system conservation being confusing, that if it's not in the system and it's used for mitigation, then that's not what it is. But I think at least if we have this on two separate lines, we can keep that straight. Tribal ICS, or any ICS for that matter, so think of on-river ICS in the same way, that at the point that it is created and it is not delivered out of Lake Mead, released from Hoover Dam, that can only result in an additional contribution to Lake Mead. It's creating ICS that still can be recovered, even during shortage all the way down to level 1025. It is only at the time of creation available as an additional quantity to the reductions that Arizona has to take. So let's say there's Arizona's taking a 512,000 acre foot quantity. ICS is created and left in Lake Mead. That does not count toward the 512 reduction. On the other hand, once ICS is there, similar to the CAP ICS that's listed up here, when it's delivered, it can be available for mitigation reductions. And actually, it reduces the accumulated contribution into the lake, or, as Tom described earlier, ECICS can be converted into DCP ICS. That does count as against Arizona's reduction quantity, and the price to pay for doing that, it is no longer recoverable, the DCP ICS, until the lake gets back up to 1110. So we had this at one point in time, yes, yes, but that was confusing, so we've peeled this apart into these various discrete actions that can be taken at the time of creation or the time of delivery or conversion. Again, on-river ICS works the same way, so we put the asterisk in there to remind people of that. USF to GSF, that's internal to Arizona, so that's water is only available for mitigation purposes. And then groundwater development through infrastructure or otherwise is available for mitigation. This chart is available to help us all keep this straight. We don't have to memorize it, but one of the main points we are trying to make here is the decisions that are made by the folks that have water to conserve have a consequence, and it's not completely fungible that if I decide to do this, I can do either this or that. Once that decision is made, you're pretty much stuck with what that water is available to use for. We have more than one goal. We're trying to put together an ag mitigation and other mitigation programs potentially. We're also trying to put together an tribal ICS program, both of which we want to work. And we have a limited number of resources. We need to find a way to use these resources in a way that we can have both of those programs work successfully. So there needs to be some orchestration and harmonization, not let's do this, and then see how it all adds up, and is it going to work out okay? There needs to be some deliberate choices made here. Questions on that? ICS issues remaining. So how did we switch over to me in the middle of this one, Tom? I don't know. Okay, but it happened, yeah. Remaining ICS issues, to draft the ICS Framework term sheet, I think everybody's anxious to see those things written down rather than just these conceptual slides about what an agreement between the Bureau, ADWR, and CAWCD would look like, and also it's not written up there, but we would need to probably have a draft implementation agreement that would look like between the Secretary and each individual tribal participant. And that, well, I guess that's the second sub-bullet there. Further explore interest in ICS participation by tribal and non-tribal on-river water users. So we've begun to get a very good idea from some folks, both the Gila River Indian community and Tana Atam have said, yes, we'd be very interested in participating in a program like this. We'd like to hear from others so we can begin to kind of scope, get an idea about how many parties are going to be involved, how many agreements that we need to do, what will it look like to further subdivide those allocations of capacity. Not that anyone will have their own reservation necessarily, because we don't want to leave empty space. But how do we make this work depending on the number of participants and the quantity that each one is interested in doing? And then this one is really important. Develop exhibits that include projects and plans for new ICS for inclusion in the LBDCP proposal, approval rather. We haven't talked about this a whole lot at the steering committee level, but we have it in the work groups that the DCP, interstate DCP approval process anticipates that all of the pending exhibits and any new exhibits that are brought forward prior to the approval of DCP at the interstate level will be wrapped up and finalized and become part and parcel of the DCP approval. Obviously, those individual exhibits need to qualify. They can't just be whatever people throw in. That's why it says includes project and plan. So there are standards for these exhibits, but there's a way to hit the ground running on these new ICS programs if we do the work now to get these exhibits in place and kind of bundle them with the DCP approval process. The work group plans to provide a recommendation to the steering committee by October 10th. We have another tribal ICS work group meeting scheduled for, I don't see it on here, I believe it is September 20. Oh, is it on the last page? Okay, it's on the last page. I'm not going to flip forward to that, but it is Monday, September 24th, 1 to 4 at ADWR, the Tribal ICS Work Group meeting number 3, which is where we will bring the draft ICS Framework term sheet and have further discussion on some of these items with a goal to get a recommendation out of the work group to the steering committee by the October 10th steering committee meeting. Here then is an outline of the upcoming steering committee meetings. We have one on September 27th. We would really like to have, as we discussed earlier, an ag mitigation and other mitigation mitigation plan package recommendation from the work group for consideration by the steering committee on the 27th, and something similar from the Tribal ICS work group on the Arizona ICS Framework for consideration, a recommendation for consideration at the October 10th meeting. Assuming we can get that business concluded on those dates, on October 25th, to have a discussion at the steering committee level of any remaining excess water and conservation plan elements that have not already been addressed by the other two items. And then on November 8th, review Arizona DCP implementation package and framework. So the comprehensive, all 4 elements together, at least have that outlined to a level that we have some comfort that we have a package that everyone can agree to, and finalize that on November 29th. And Tom earlier today set the bar a little bit higher for us, which is, can we get that done on November 9th, by November 9th, and enjoy our turkey or whatever else it is that we're doing in the intervening week. It's an ambitious schedule, but I think it's possible for us to do. And this is a nice little picture, again, for people whose brains work that way. There's a little picture of the Arizona DCP implementation framework. There's 4 essential elements. They all interlink with each other. There are some shared provisions from one element to another. But if we can come up with a comprehensive agreements that satisfies the parties in each one of these blocks, and those parties can say, I have what I need to be able to support this, and I will consent, I'll use that word again, to what other folks need to do in the other blocks to make those things work. Then the work that we have to do after that is write this all down and get people to commit to that in a way that there can be some surety as we move forward that this is going to continue to work for 7 years. Any questions on that?
So then we're at the point in time where we've had lots of good discussion already from the delegates around the table. Any more discussion, questions, comments from delegates around the table? Tim.
So I have two quick comments. One is part of our role has been to solicit feedback from our stakeholder groups and report that back here. I think generally people are positive and optimistic about getting to a deal here, and I think people are seeing good progress. There's one parallel activity that's not one of the four, and I'm not arguing that it needs to be one of the four, but it's just something we can't lose sight of, is CAP has the non-project CAP water quality work group moving forward. There's a framework that's in development. When we look at shortage, when we look at water needs, we're going to be looking at lots of water wanting to be moved through the canal. That framework is critical to making that done well, making sure it's, that the tools that we're all counting on having in place in order to commit to anything under DCP, water quality is a critical component of that. So I'm expressing that we've been very active in that group. We've seen a lot of progress on that group, and I think things are coming together well from our perspective. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that that's also a critical component that we need to make sure gets to the finish line at some point in the near future. And again, I think we're headed in a very good direction there. But I wanted to provide that feedback because I'm hearing it from more than one person let's not lose sight of that. The other thing I just want to express that I didn't participate in the ICS concept development, but what you presented today made sense. I think, you know, of course, when that needle moves up and down, and now anything that comes to removing ICS, whether it's to create, you know, back down to 50-50 as capacity or whatever mitigation it might be used for, that's really the crux of any concerns we would have. I don't have a specific concern other than what's been expressed by my colleagues here at the table. But I just wanted to express support for the fact that I think it's a well thought out framework, and it does make sense, and we're supportive of tribal ICS and ICS in general.
Thanks, Tim. Any others?
Tom.
Yes, I just want to report that the ag pool districts or representatives of the districts met yesterday and discussed the ag mitigation proposals in detail. We seem to be unanimous in our support of the proposal as it's been put forth essentially on page 10 for the mitigation amount, including Harquahala. And we also are willing to consider other options for the mitigation water supply if they become a reality that are could be potentially displace some of the ones that are listed as firm in the report. So we certainly are leaving that door open, but at this point the districts are supportive of the process and supportive of where we are, and are very positive about the direction we've gone in.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. The community is pleased to be a part of the steering committee meetings and also in the working group, and we will continue to do so. there's still work to be done, and what I'm hearing right now is good, and to be a part of this, it's truly helpful. So the community will continue to be a part in engagement and all these various elements that come together and continue on with the DCP package, and hopefully the best interests of the community and the entire state. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Bowers.
Thank you, sir. The good part about getting older and having a memory is that we can remember some of the details of the past of the 70s when we put the Groundwater Management Act was put by people even in this room who worked on that effort. And the circumstances that brought it and the circumstances of today are different than those circumstances. And yet we're able to, look jointly for a solution that will at least lift and carry as many as are in the state forward through a drought. Senator Griffin and I have been favored to go around the state, and Senator Tondo and Ms. Gabaldon and others. Ms. Engel's been there, and Mr. Cook has been there. And it's unique in every part of the state, the unique subsets of problems about water. And it's very tempting to solve those problems with linkage. And because this is of such importance to the central part of the state, primarily, that it's very tempting because they're very important. And we will look to those solutions, but we hope to be able to, in fact, our desire is to move ahead with them, but not linking them to this. And we've done both in time. When you have something that everybody needs, the Christmas tree looks wonderful. But all things being equal, if we keep moving on as we've seen, we would like us to pare down the exceptional or non-focused challenges that we have solutions for that we would love to bring into this, and just get this DCP structure done. And then we will continue on other issues as well, with hopefully equal passion. But we surely thank all those who participated and hope to be a help to you as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Bowers, and I will commit to you that I will be involved in those discussions with equal passion, and so will my department.
I also want to express appreciation and compliments on the Arizona ICS Framework report today. I think it shows significant progress, and really appreciate seeing that in the overall interest of in this process. In the category of reporting from constituency groups, one of our responsibilities as steering committee members is to be in contact with our various constituencies. Our colleagues at Arizona Audubon had a webinar this week as part of that process. We talked about the Lower Basin DCP and its importance. Ted Kowalski and I presented. So that brings up two comments. One, we heard a number of issues around the state from folks, some of whom may have shown up at the joint legislative committee hearings that have been happening around the state. Probably some of those same folks raising concerns about other issues. The way Ted and I answered those concerns candidly was, we need to work on those, but we don't see them being linked and part of what this steering committee needs to solve in this time frame. The other observation I would make is, while I would certainly agree with Mr. Bowers that trying to create a highly complex Christmas tree to get a DCP framework in place is not advisable, I would observe, and from the conversations I've been involved in, principally the CAP Ag Mitigation Group, that between now and getting to November 8th and success, we should not be surprised if some of the parties who are asked to give something up higher priority water users, folks who are being asked to contribute water and or money, might ask for consideration. They might ask for some aspects of evolution of our policy that they think is necessary for them to agree to the provisions that we're talking about. So I would just put that out there, that in the conversations that happen around this table on the outside, we shouldn't be surprised by that, and hopefully we'll be open to that and have authentic negotiation in that about those ideas.
Thanks. Others? Hunter.
Director, I'd like to just compliment you and your staff, and I'd specifically like to thank Ted and his staff, along with all the tribal entities who've been part of the discussion. I think the Arizona ICS framework that was described, and I'll echo Tim's comments, very common sense, very thoughtful, and I appreciate the compromises that I see in that. So thank you very much for the work that's been done on that. I look forward to the other discussions, and I appreciate Mr. Bauer's comments.
Thanks, Hunter. Anyone else? You want to take the next page, Ted? So we won't repeat. I think we've done this a couple times now, going through this next meetings. You can all see it on the screen. I will, though, talk about the update on the draft DCP documents. We are meeting next week with the basin states to discuss this some more. We want to get to a point where we can share the actual documents with folks in Arizona. Maybe that'll be after next week, we'll see, but one of the difficulties I'll just throw out on the table is there are different views in different states about what the right timing is to share documents. That relates to their internal issues, it relates to their approval processes in front of certain boards. So we're trying to work through that with them on those issues to get everyone a chance to see the documents and got comfortable that everything is covered in the series of documents that we are working on. Again, at the next meetings, we want to review, the recommendation from the Ag Mitigation Workgroup, see where we are with the Tribal ICS Workgroup on the Arizona ICS Framework. So I appreciate everyone's really hard work. We're probably ready then for the public to make comments if they would like to. Anybody sitting in the audience like to address the steering committee? Got a mic?
I guess we don't.
No mic?
I guess so.
Sorry.
I've lived there for 40 years. And first, I would like to thank the co-chairs of the steering committee for the opportunity for the public to address them, and more specifically for the comments that I would like to make now. I continue to have a key concern with how the DCP process is proceeding. This concern is the lack of openness and transparency of decision-making processes. Like water itself, planning for the future of this critical life-sustaining public resource should be fully transparent. Just before the DCP steering committee started its meetings, co-chairs Bushatsky and Cook wrote on June 28th in an article of the Arizona Department of Water Resources website about the DCP steering committee that, quote, discussions will be open and the public is invited to participate, end quote. This was a welcome change from last year's DCP discussions when a group was convened by the governor with no public notice or exposure and which even excluded our state legislators. But once the DCP steering committee started taking up specific issues, the first being mitigation for agriculture, Co-Chairman Bishatsky announced at the DCP steering committee meeting on August 9th that a working group was being created to discuss the agriculture mitigation question, and of the working group meetings, he stated, quote, "They are not going to be public meetings per se, but the group will have a charge and a commitment to report back to the steering committee on their discussions and deliberations as part of the steering committee process, and that will be the opportunity for the public who are not delegates, who will not be participating, to have their input and understanding where that group is heading," end quote. At the DCP steering committee meeting of August 23rd, a second working group was created to make recommendations on the intentionally created surplus issue. Now there are two working groups whose meetings are closed to the public per se. It is unfortunate that the direction the DCP has taken is once again toward exclusion of substantive public involvement and oversight, and a lack of transparency. And ironically, there is a need for people to attend the workgroup meetings so the workgroup members have the opportunity to hear, as Co-Chairman Bishatsky said at the last meeting of the steering committee, quote, "important input," end quote, for the working group. But the process for integrating this important input is flawed. To illustrate, I'd like to read Co-Chairman Bishatsky's remarks about the Ag Mitigation Workgroup. If there are folks who have connections into any of the delegates or alternates who volunteered, these folks are welcome to bring you along as their staff. So we wanted that to be broad on purpose to help populate that work group with as many folks as we could who had important input to give into that process. I'll also say, and maybe more about this when we get there, that it was valuable. We had some members of the audience, so to speak, in that ag mitigation work group get up and speak to help answer questions, and I thought that was a valuable part of the work group process, end quote. Here's the problem with this approach to process. You have to have connections to get into the meeting and an invitation by a work group member. This is the antithesis of democratic decision-making and transparency, and the result of this approach privileges the few over the many. There are people who also have important input to give, but who are excluded from the process. This is unacceptable, especially given the far-ranging public impacts of the decisions and recommendations under consideration. In the interest of government transparency, the meeting should be open to the public, whether they have important input to offer or not, and not whether you have connections to a work group member. Another irony, by closing the meetings to the interested public, it actually creates more concern about secrecy and backroom deals than if the meetings were open to the public. This can also lead people to assume the worst about the process or have less trust in the process's outcomes. I do have a question at the end. And I guess you're a member of the audience. I think you should go through the chair if you want to ask my question. I think everyone here would agree that this is a crucial time for Arizona's future direction and sustainability, especially as it pertains to water. Water and who or what gets how much is an issue of great importance to the state. It is basic to survival, a just society, and sustaining the health of natural systems we depend upon. I would like to request the following of the DCP Steering Committee co-chairman. Open the water working group meetings to the public so that all interested people can attend if they wish without having to have the right connections. I also would like to know if there is any reason these working group meetings should not be open to the public as required under Arizona's open meeting law. Even if the work group meetings don't fall under the scope of Arizona's open meeting law, I ask the DCP Steering Committee co-chairs to declare them open to the public for purposes of transparency, promoting the flow of accurate information, and in the spirit of the open meeting law. Thank you for your consideration of these important issues.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Mark Lewis, and I'm the most senior member of the CAP Water Board, and I want to thank all of you for your time and energy. I know this stuff is tough, and welcome to my world, because we do this all the time. And I want to leave you with 3 thoughts. Number 1 is, for the most part, we're not going to have all the answers when we get to the finish line of a product that we're going to sort of like. And the best thing everyone can do is leave us with as many possible tools and options that we can work through with in the future, and don't fix us on any one given sort of strategy. We can get there, and we can have an agreement that everybody can live with, but you got to give us the tools to work with, and you got to get us to the money part, which has got to come up here pretty soon. The second thing is my view today is that we have a DCP plan that gives priority over others, and those others are not yet benefited on this on the mitigation portion of this. And we need to get to that quicker than later, and it's going to cost a lot of money, and we understand that. But I would leave you with one thought. Don't cram the board down with a big bill and a lot of water and no tools to make it work. Thank you.
Anyone else? Seeing none, I'll thank everybody for attending, participating, and we're adjourned.